Indeed. Well, while the month-old ceasefire in Gaza holds, the situation remains dire on the ground. By some estimates, more than 300 Palestinians have been killed since the US-led peace plan came into effect. Earlier, I spoke to ActionAid's Country Director for Palestine, Jamil Sawalmeh, about the current situation in Gaza, but also in the West Bank.
But unfortunately, the situation continues to be challenging, and unfortunately, in some instances, it's deteriorating further. Now, referring to the situation in the West Bank, unfortunately, we still see wide-scale military incursions happening, especially in the northern part of the West Bank, around the refugee camps, but also with military operations happening sporadically in different areas across the West Bank, which is also coupled with attacks on Palestinian livelihoods, attacks on Palestinian farmers, most recently in the olive harvest season, which was one of the most challenging seasons for the Palestinian farmers here in the West Bank. With a spike in the number of Israeli settlers' attacks on these farmers, in addition, of course, to the continued forcible transfer in the West Bank. So far, we have more than 50,000 people who have been internally displaced in the West Bank. This is the largest wave since the war in 1967, with no prospect for these refugees returning back to their homes, since most of these homes in the refugee camps have been demolished. Movement obstruction also continued to be challenging in the West Bank because of the Israeli checkpoints and gates. So far, Israel have installed more than 1,000 gates in the West Bank. So we can say that every community, every village, town, and city in the West Bank is now isolated by a gate installed by the Israeli army. On the other side, also in Gaza, despite that, the fact that the ceasefire have brought a sigh of relief for the civilian population in Gaza, but unfortunately the humanitarian conditions continue to be very, very challenging for the civilian population, especially when we talk about the systematic obstruction of aid. We still don't see any sufficient amount of aid being transported into Gaza to combat the most recent acute malnutrition, and of course the impact of the starvation and the engineered famine that was happening for Gaza for many, many months. Therefore, the situation for the civilians continued to be extremely challenging, especially now that we have already entered into winter here. We have seen thunderstorms and heavy rain hitting these civilians living in tents that are not really in the best conditions for these civilians to live in, especially that one of the items that Israel still systematically...
Is the aid at checkpoints? Is it there ready to go? Have you got it there, but it's just not getting to where it needs to go?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. International organizations, including ActionAid and also UN agencies, have positioned aid at the crossings 2 years ago. There was enough and sufficient amounts of aids positioned, especially at the crossings with Egypt. When Rafah crossing was still opening, there was huge amount of aid positioned in Egypt. Also now, since Israel now operating through Kerem Abu Salim crossing, international organizations, including UN agencies, have huge amounts of aid piled up at the Egyptian side of the borders, and it's been obstructed. Unfortunately, also Israel have destroyed many truckloads of aid that was obstructed and not being allowed into Gaza at the Israeli side of the crossing. So therefore, in terms of the availability of aid, yes, and we are able to scale up as well. All of international organizations have the ability to scale up their aid once we have secure access into Gaza and the ability to transport it. Especially that we know now in the past period, Israel has been also denying aid for the vast majority of international organizations. More than 90% of the coordination requests submitted to the Israeli army have been denied. Therefore, there is no excuse of saying that there isn't enough and sufficient aid. While we have actually expected with the